Jeremy Lancaster had spent the better part of his adult life surrounded by conference rooms, legal pads, and the relentless hum of institutional tension. As a strategic consultant in corporate restructuring, he had been the man called in when things were on fire, sometimes figuratively, sometimes dangerously close to literal. But that life was behind him now. After 30 years of playing chess with other people's empires, after too many flights, too many empty hotel rooms, and too many weekends blurred into Monday mornings, Jeremy retired and did what many men his age only talked about doing. He bought land just far enough from the city to hear the difference. It wasn't a farm, not exactly. He didn't grow crops or raise cattle, and he didn't wear boots as a costume. He bought a home, an unassuming L-shaped brick house with a detached garage and a sizable lot out back, and quietly shaped it into something entirely his own. No banners, no mission statements, no business cards. Just a space that finally made sense. It was, in many ways, the first time Jeremy had lived anywhere with the intent of staying. In his youth, there had been apartments filled with ambition and not much else. Later, condos with too much glass and too little soul. In the end, he wanted quiet, but not silence. He wanted the sound of wind moving through trees that hadn't been planted by a developer. He wanted morning light through real windows, not polarized panels. And above all, he wanted something alive. Something that required care, but offered no demands of productivity. That's how the chickens came into his life. Not as a joke or a novelty, but as something gently grounding. He had 6 hens, all with names, though he never told anyone what they were. It was personal, and that was the point. The coop was a modest structure, hand-built over 2 weekends with a friend from out of state who owed Jeremy a few favors and was happy to swing a hammer in exchange for whiskey and grilled fish. The enclosure was secure, elevated to protect from flooding, and tucked along the back fence far from any neighbor's line of sight. The hens roamed during the day inside a spacious, shaded run, returning each evening on their own. Jeremy kept the space clean, monitored their health, and collected eggs daily, quietly proud of the fact that he could now cook breakfast entirely from his own property. The birds were well kept, docile, and never made enough noise to draw attention. Not that attention had seemed to be an issue. For the first few months his neighbors were pleasant but distant, the way people often are in semi-suburban developments that aren't quite country but aren't city either. They waved when he passed by, nodded at the mailbox, exchanged occasional remarks about the weather or trash pickup schedules, but nothing more. It suited him. There was one exception to this, Karen Brookshire, the president of the local community board. Not officially a homeowners association, but a neighborhood committee with more power than it had any right to wield. She was, from the beginning, too attentive. Her tone was always polite, but it had the clipped, artificial brightness of someone who had practiced it in the mirror. She introduced herself within hours of his moving truck leaving, walking up his drive with a welcome folder and an unsolicited list of community guidelines printed in 10-point font on pale yellow paper. "We're a proud community," she said with an earnestness that felt more rehearsed than heartfelt. "We like to preserve a certain order. I'm sure you understand." Jeremy didn't reply with anything more than a nod. He knew her type. He'd seen it in corporate offices, in stakeholder meetings, in the cold calculations behind words like cohesion and community values. He smiled, took the papers, and politely declined the offer to join the neighborhood beautification task force. It was 3 months before the first letter arrived. Folded neatly and slid under his door, not mailed. The stationery matched the welcome packet, and the signature was, of course, Karen's. She had received a concern from another resident, anonymous, naturally, regarding the presence of poultry on the property. According to her, the community guidelines did not permit livestock. Jeremy read the note twice, calmly set it down on the kitchen table, and brewed himself a cup of tea before responding. He replied not with anger, but with precision. His letter included a copy of the property zoning classification, a highlighted section from the township ordinances distinguishing livestock from domestic fowl kept in limited numbers for personal, non-commercial use, and a notarized statement from a local animal health inspector confirming the cleanliness and compliance of his coop. He hand-delivered the packet to Karen's house that evening, sliding it into her mailbox without a word. Days passed. There was no response. Then came the second letter, this one less formal, more aggressive in tone. She claimed that while the township's guidelines might allow certain exceptions, the community's standards went above and beyond to ensure quality of life. Jeremy smiled when he read that phrase. He'd written those words himself, 100 times in reports that gutted departments and sold off divisions. He knew what quality of life meant when it came from a board president. It meant preference disguised as policy. He didn't answer this letter. He didn't need to. He had no obligation to respond to an informal advisory from a self-appointed committee with no legal standing. He let it sit. Weeks went by. The air began to change, not the temperature but the texture of everyday interaction. Neighbors who once waved now avoided eye contact. One man crossed the street when Jeremy approached on his morning walk. A package was left in the driveway instead of at the porch. It wasn't hostile, but it was clear. Karen's influence was subtle and pervasive. He'd underestimated her, and that, he realized, was his first mistake. It was during one of these quieter mornings that Jeremy had his idea. He wasn't a man prone to theatrics, but he did appreciate precision and irony, especially when leveraged against absurdity. If the problem was optics, if Karen objected not to the chickens themselves, but to the idea of chickens, then perhaps the solution was not to remove the birds, but to elevate them. Not in status, of course, but in presentation. So, with quiet humor and a touch of calculated defiance, Jeremy had small vests made. Nothing garish, just tasteful little fabric harnesses embroidered with phrases like board liaison, chair of scratch committee, and community engagement officer. He let the hens wear them during the afternoons when they were out in the yard. He took a few pictures, nothing dramatic, just shots from his garden bench as they pecked around the run, and posted them on a private neighborhood app with the caption, "The committee thanks you for your continued support." The reaction was immediate and divided. Some neighbors responded with laughing emojis, others with nothing at all. One woman, new to the area, commented that it was the best thing I've seen all week. But the silence from Karen's account was deafening. 2 days later, another letter arrived, this time with a formal complaint alleging mockery of committee structure, public undermining of neighborhood standards, and a renewed demand for the removal of all unauthorized animals. This time, Jeremy didn't reply with documents. He didn't reply at all, but he wasn't idle. He made a phone call to a municipal liaison he'd worked with during his consulting years, a man who had moved to the city council's compliance department. Jeremy asked him to review the board's registration, bylaws, and any legal authority they might claim. The man promised to get back to him within the week. In the meantime, Jeremy began documenting everything. Each letter, each interaction, every delivery left outside the lines, every comment muttered in passing. He kept logs, photos, and timestamps, not because he planned to use them immediately, but because he knew what it meant to be caught off guard without evidence. By the time Karen made her next move, Jeremy would be ready. He wasn't interested in drama. He wasn't looking for attention. But what he would not do, what he had never done, was submit to nonsense cloaked in the illusion of authority. And as he sat on his porch that evening, watching the sun slip behind the trees while his hens settled in for the night, he knew that this wasn't about birds or bylaws or even Karen. This was about control. And control, Jeremy knew better than anyone, always had a cost. And someone would have to pay. The shift didn't happen overnight, but Jeremy felt it like the slow turning of a gear somewhere deep in the foundation of the neighborhood. After his last, quiet act of mockery, a gesture that barely qualified as satire but clearly struck the nerve it was aimed at, things began to change in texture rather than volume. The silence from Karen's side wasn't just strategic anymore, it was loaded. There was no official reply to the photos of the hens in their modest vests. No formal rebuke, no escalation that Jeremy could immediately see. But then came the vanishing gestures of goodwill. Neighbors who had previously exchanged nods now turned their backs a few degrees at the mailbox. Invitations to casual events ceased. A local landscaping crew that had mowed Jeremy's front lawn for the past 2 months without issue suddenly stopped returning calls, and when he finally managed to catch the owner, the man stammered something about priorities and hung up, mid-sentence. The coldness was not loud, but it was comprehensive. At first, Jeremy assumed it was the sort of social friction that comes with standing one's ground. People don't always appreciate defiance, even when it's harmless. But he had underestimated Karen's skill in narrative control. She didn't confront him directly, nor did she try to argue policy face-to-face. She understood the greater power of suggestion, the art of embedding doubt into conversations at book clubs, at church brunches, at sidewalk chats where truths were replaced with convenient impressions. "He's reclusive, but not in the harmless way," she allegedly said to one neighbor, who later relayed it to Jeremy in confidence. "I just worry about what's going on behind that fence. And those animals? Well, we don't really know how many he's keeping, do we?" The implication was clear. If she couldn't get him to remove the chickens through legal channels, she would do it through social pressure. And yet, Jeremy might have endured that. He'd lived through far worse manipulation in his career. He'd worked with CEOs who could turn betrayal into a handshake and market it as synergy. He knew the language of coded hostility, the way bureaucracy wraps itself around personalities like Ivy. What changed everything wasn't gossip. It was the notice he received one rainy Thursday morning, slipped not into his mailbox but taped to his front gate. Bold, bright orange, and stamped "Urgent, Final Notice." The letter wasn't from the community board itself, but from the county zoning office, referencing a community-initiated inquiry into unpermitted agricultural activity on residential property. According to the complaint, Jeremy was in violation of County Ordinance 2417B, which regulated the use of residential-zoned land for farming or livestock-related activities not explicitly approved by municipal exception. The language was sharp, legalistic, and completely at odds with the actual nature of Jeremy's setup. His hens were not livestock under state definition, and his property, while residential, fell under a subzone that allowed for limited personal animal keeping, an exception precisely defined in the county records. He had verified this before ever building the coop. Still, the notice was real. It advised him to appear for an administrative review within 10 business days. Failure to respond could result in fines, enforced removal, or legal escalation. He reread it 3 times, noting the lack of specifics. No pictures, no names, just an opaque reference to community concerns, and a heavy-handed reminder of consequences. It wasn't difficult to guess where it had originated. Jeremy didn't even bother calling the board. He reached instead for a yellow folder he had labeled Defense and slipped the notice into it with a quiet grimace. Rather than responding immediately, he spent the day walking his property, documenting everything with time-stamped photos. He took wide-angle shots of the coop, the surrounding land, the distance between the enclosure and neighboring homes, and even the compost bin, though it hadn't been mentioned. He then scanned his original zoning approval and placed a call to his contact in municipal planning, a man named Daniel, whom Jeremy had worked with years ago during a contentious corporate land use debate involving a reclassified development parcel. Daniel, to his credit, remembered Jeremy immediately and agreed to pull the county file on the inquiry. 2 days later, Daniel called back, his tone hesitant but professional. "You're being targeted," he said plainly. "The complaint didn't come through the standard form. It was submitted in person, flagged urgent, and pushed through by someone with a letter of endorsement from the local civic committee." Jeremy asked who had signed the endorsement, but Daniel said it was redacted under privacy protections. Still, the timing matched Karen's disappearance from social functions that week, and it wasn't hard to draw the line between cause and effect. Daniel went further. "Honestly, the complaint is weak. There's no evidence and your parcel has the necessary exemptions. But the fact that it was flagged this way means someone's trying to make noise. If you attend the review hearing and present your case cleanly, this will likely get thrown out. But you should know, it's been assigned to a compliance officer who used to work with residential enforcement. She's meticulous. If they find anything even marginally outside code, they'll write it up." That was enough for Jeremy. He prepared meticulously. He didn't just show up to the hearing. He arrived with a printed binder containing his original purchase documentation, the zoning map, a statement from a licensed poultry veterinarian certifying the animal's health, and a personal letter from his doctor citing the therapeutic recommendation that had led him to keep hens in the first place. The compliance officer, as promised, was strict. She questioned him about co-op construction, food storage, waste management, and rodent mitigation, all of which Jeremy answered calmly and precisely. The board voted to dismiss the complaint by unanimous agreement, with a formal warning about remaining in compliance with maximum animal allowances and community visibility standards. Jeremy accepted the outcome, though it rang hollow. What bothered him most wasn't that someone had tried to remove his birds. It was the method, the cowardice of anonymous escalation, the weaponization of process under the guise of concern. He had dealt with real accountability in his career, had stood in front of billion-dollar shareholders and delivered bad news with his name printed clearly at the top of the presentation. But this was the kind of underhanded maneuvering that corrupted entire systems. And the fact that it was being done over 6 hens made it all the more grotesque. Still, he returned home not defeated, but sharpened. He made changes, small ones at first. He added privacy lattice work to the fencing and reinforced the cope door, not out of paranoia, but as a precaution. He replaced his front-facing mailbox with a locked unit. And he installed cameras, not the kind meant for show, but discrete, weather-resistant models positioned at angles that captured activity at the property line, the co-op, and the driveway. Not because he intended to start a war, but because he suspected one had already begun without his consent. A week after the hearing, another envelope appeared, this time inside his mailbox, postmarked with the local branch and addressed in what appeared to be Karen's handwriting. It wasn't typed, nor was it signed, but the message was unmistakable. Perhaps if you spent less time antagonizing your neighbors and more time reflecting on the spirit of the community, we wouldn't have to escalate things. Consider your actions, Jeremy. This place was peaceful before you arrived. He sat with the letter for a long time, not out of fear but calculation. He reread the phrase, "We wouldn't have to escalate things," and felt the shift, the pretense finally cracking. This wasn't about chickens. It never had been. It was about control, compliance, and the subtle punishment of anyone who refused to fold. And Jeremy, having built a career out of dismantling systems from the inside, now saw clearly what lay ahead. He knew the next move wasn't his to make. It would come quietly, in the form of paperwork or whispered accusations, but it would come. And when it did, he would not meet it with noise or protest. He would respond the only way he knew how, with facts, documentation, and absolute resolve. Let them escalate. He would be ready. Jeremy had always believed that escalation, in its most dangerous form, wasn't loud or overt. It didn't arrive with slammed doors or public confrontations. It arrived slowly, wrapped in plausibility, with a pleasant tone and a paper trail so neatly constructed it left no fingerprints. That's why, when the first unexpected invoice arrived, buried within a standard packet of seasonal community updates, he didn't immediately raise an eyebrow. At first glance, it appeared to be a routine statement. Minor dues, winter landscaping assessments, notices about upcoming sidewalk repairs. But at the very bottom of the page, highlighted in dull gray and printed in a slightly smaller font, was a line item labeled Non-Compliance Fee, Domestic Animal Violation. The sum wasn't large, $150, but it was the phrasing that caught his attention. Not livestock, not unauthorized construction, but domestic animal violation. It was language designed to avoid legal specificity while retaining administrative authority. Jeremy reread the line twice before setting the page down and walking without hurry to the file cabinet in his office where he kept everything. Every correspondence, every zoning letter, every legal document associated with his property since the day he signed the deed. The term used on that invoice didn't match any previously used language in formal community or municipal documents. It was new, and it was vague by design. Instead of reacting immediately, Jeremy made photocopies and then visited the local municipal records office the next morning. He asked for access to any recent amendments or motions passed by the neighborhood board. The clerk, a younger woman who clearly wasn't used to being spoken to in full sentences, hesitated, then offered a neutral smile and disappeared into the back room. She returned 15 minutes later with a small folder labeled Community Standards Clarification, Addendum C, September. On Ike, the date was recent. Inside, Jeremy found a 2-page document that purported to clarify previously ambiguous definitions of permissible animal keeping. Among the revisions was a new clause stating that any animal kept in a non-standard behavioral role, with examples given as costumed animals, trained non-companion species, or symbolic representations, may be subject to additional review or enforcement at the board's discretion. Jeremy read the line 3 times before setting the folder down gently and thanking the clerk for her time. He didn't argue. He didn't ask questions. But something in his posture must have communicated his thoughts clearly enough, because she didn't meet his eyes as he left. By the time he returned home, he had received an email from a neighbor, someone he barely knew, stating that there had been growing concern over Jeremy's property being used as a source of tension. The message was cautious, carefully worded, and filled with qualifiers, but the point was clear. The pressure campaign was working. The neighborhood had begun to fracture, not out of ideology but discomfort. People didn't want a fight, even a quiet one. They wanted peace, predictability, and plausible deniability. Jeremy represented the opposite. Someone who resisted control without raising his voice. Someone who didn't fall in line when asked, but also didn't give them the spectacle of rebellion they could publicly condemn. Later that week, while working in the shed, Jeremy noticed something odd near the edge of the property line. A small white flag staked into the ground, roughly the size of a playing card. It bore no writing, just a mark, an emblem he recognized from the corner of the Community Standard Clarification document. A surveyor's marker. He walked the length of the backyard and found 3 more, each aligned to form a line bisecting his property, cutting through the coop area and stopping just short of the detached garage. It didn't make sense. His property lines were well established, recorded in county records, and matched the survey included in his purchase file. This wasn't a mistake. It was a move. A deliberate, silent suggestion that his land was under review. He photographed each flag, marked their coordinates, and filed them in his growing dossier. 3 days later, a contractor appeared on his property without notice. He was a man in his late 50s, wearing a reflective vest and holding a clipboard, claiming to be performing preliminary measurement assessments for planned underground fiber installation. Jeremy asked to see the work order, and the man obliged. an official-looking sheet bearing the logo of a local telecom provider and a routing number that, upon later inspection, did not exist in the company's internal records. Jeremy let the man finish his walkabout but followed him discreetly, taking notes. The contractor didn't go near the road or the areas marked on the supposed installation map. Instead, he lingered around the coop, took photos, and muttered numbers into a small recorder. Jeremy said nothing until the man turned to leave. "You'll want to be careful with where you point those flags," he said, not unkindly. The contractor paused, half-smiled, and replied, "Just following instructions, sir. We don't ask questions." And then he was gone. Jeremy spent the evening drafting a letter to the telecom provider's legal department, requesting confirmation of authorized presence and clarifying that no access had been granted or warranted. He didn't expect a quick reply, but he understood the importance of establishing the first move in a paper trail. He also filed a separate notice to the county registrar, requesting to be informed of any boundary disputes or filings related to parcel reclassification. The formality of the steps didn't make them any less urgent. He was tightening the perimeter, not physically but procedurally, and he knew from experience that such preparation was the difference between defense and disaster. The following week, Jeremy received a formal notice of hearing. This time, the charge wasn't zoning or sanitation. It was a procedural complaint filed by the board, alleging willful non-cooperation with oversight activities, and citing obstruction of scheduled survey work as grounds for administrative penalty. The tone of the letter had changed. It was no longer passive-aggressive, but outright disciplinary. It included a proposed fine, $500, and a warning that repeat incidents could result in referral to municipal mediation or civil court. Jeremy read the notice with cold clarity. They were no longer trying to annoy him into compliance. They were attempting to provoke a mistake, an overreaction, a technical misstep, anything that could be leveraged as justification for escalation. He wasn't surprised. He was only disappointed by how predictably they played their hand. Instead of responding, he requested a public records release of all formal complaints submitted by the board in the past 3 years. He cross-referenced addresses, violations, and subsequent sales. What he found didn't shock him. It confirmed what he had already suspected. 3 properties, all cited for unusual use or nonconformity, had been fined repeatedly, and each owner had eventually sold within the year. Each of those homes was subsequently purchased through a holding company with an address that matched the contact information for Karen's husband's former real estate firm. The pieces were not just falling into place. They had been placed long ago, with the precision of someone who understood how to weaponize process while keeping their hands technically clean. Jeremy compiled the data into a clean timeline, submitted it through his attorney to the local ombudsman, and made sure to copy the Municipal Ethics Review Board. He didn't announce it. He didn't warn Karen. He let the mechanism of accountability begin its slow, grinding motion in silence. He understood that by the time anyone responded, the situation would have already escalated further. And he was right. The next morning, he found one of his hens dead, outside the coop. Not mauled, not torn by a fox or a dog, just stiff, neck twisted, feathers intact, no signs of predation. The fence had been clipped, a panel left ajar just wide enough for a hand or a boot. Jeremy didn't call the police. He took photographs, collected the body, and brought it to the vet. The necropsy showed blunt force trauma. No poison, no disease. Just a strike, clean and deliberate. The vet, an older man with a military bearing and no tolerance for euphemism, looked him squarely in the eye and said, "This wasn't an animal attack. This was a warning." Jeremy buried the hen behind the garage that afternoon, not with grief, but with method. He poured gravel over the grave, stacked a modest cairn, and installed a camera on the motion sensor light above the shed. Then he wrote a letter, not to the board, not to Karen, but to his neighbors. A calm, formal message inviting them to a private, informal meeting at his property, offering coffee, pastries, and an open explanation of what had been happening. No accusations, no politics, just transparency. 10 households came. 5 more responded by phone. And in that quiet gathering, over folding chairs and quiet sips of coffee, Jeremy laid out the story. Not the drama, but the facts. He showed the documents. He explained the language. He answered every question. And when he was done, he simply said, "I don't need allies. I just need you to see what's being done in your name." He didn't ask for support, but he got it. Quiet nods. A few emails later that night. One neighbor left a message on his answering machine. "I used to think you were just being difficult. Now I think you're the only one being honest." Jeremy didn't smile. He just filed the recording, checked the cameras, and went to bed. The game had changed. And they weren't playing alone anymore. By the time Jeremy received the letter from the board formally suspending his cooperative privileges, pending resolution of a pattern of misconduct, the conflict had evolved beyond mere disagreements over poultry. The phrase itself, cooperative privileges, was absurd on its face. He hadn't asked to be part of their meetings, had never attended a board-organized event, and certainly hadn't relied on the supposed benefits their leadership offered the neighborhood. But that wasn't the point. The suspension, delivered via certified mail and hand-dropped notice on his door within minutes of each other, served as both a symbolic punishment and a calculated signal to others. It was an assertion of dominance masked in administrative prose, and Jeremy, having spent decades helping corporations refine such tactics for shareholder compliance, knew precisely what it meant. They were trying to isolate him further, create procedural justification for treating him as a non-member, an outsider, even within the boundaries of his own home. What they hadn't accounted for was that Jeremy had already reached a point beyond tolerance. It wasn't that he was angry. Anger had passed weeks ago. What remained was focus, and a cold clarity born of watching a situation that should have ended with a neighborly conversation metastasize into systemic manipulation. He knew now that Karen was not acting out of personal vendetta alone. There was an agenda behind her control, one that wasn't simply about birds or fences or bylaws, but about real estate and quiet acquisition. The evidence had mounted like sediment. 3 homes pressured, cited, and quietly sold. Anonymous complaints submitted in handwriting that, when layered over one another, betrayed a singular hand despite the illusion of diversity. And now, a subtle legal wall being built to box him in, to make his removal a matter of compliance rather than conflict. But Jeremy wasn't without tools, and he wasn't alone anymore. The informal neighborhood meeting had done more than earn him sympathy. It had drawn out reluctant voices, people who had also been pressured, fined, warned over aesthetic infractions or ambiguous decorum violations, and who had accepted it all, silently until someone else stood still long enough to become a target worth watching. Within a week, Jeremy had compiled a short dossier of other incidents. A woman fined for planting vegetables in her front yard, a man warned over excessive front porch presence after installing a rocking chair and potted fern. Most weren't dramatic enough to provoke resistance, but now that patterns were emerging, people were starting to connect them, and once a pattern is seen, it cannot be unseen. Jeremy's next move was deliberate, subtle, and fully legal. He submitted a formal petition to the county to create a temporary educational agricultural demonstration site, citing his co-op as a pilot project for sustainable micro-farming. It was not an attempt to bait Karen or challenge the board directly. It was a legal maneuver to temporarily reclassify the portion of his land that housed the hens under a different usage category, thereby putting it under the jurisdiction of a different municipal department for the next 90 days. The county's agricultural liaison approved the request without hesitation, noting the clean history of the property, the documented veterinary visits, and the absence of prior violations. With that single stamp of approval, Karen and her board lost the one leverage point they had left. The chickens were no longer under their domain. Jeremy didn't gloat. He simply added the updated land use certificate to his binder and sent a copy, politely, to the board with no cover letter. The response came in the form of silence, and then, within days, overcompensation. A new round of letters went out across the neighborhood, warning of a rise in property value risks associated with ambiguous zoning practices. Jeremy received 3 different neighbors' forwarded emails, all containing subtle warnings, cautioning them to remain alert to shifting standards and to report non-conforming behaviors. Karen was casting a wide net, hoping someone, anyone, would bite, but it backfired. One neighbor, a retired math teacher named Denise, responded publicly in the community group chat. If they start warning us about gardens and chickens, what's next? Prohibiting wind chimes. The comment drew a flurry of likes, including from people who had previously stayed silent. The board didn't respond, and Jeremy knew then that something had shifted. That same week, an official-looking vehicle parked across from his house for nearly 4 hours. No one got out, no badge was shown, no clipboard was carried. Jeremy didn't approach. He simply noted the time, the license plate, and placed a call to a contact in vehicle registration. The plate came back linked to a property services company under contract with a private real estate acquisition firm that specialized in distressed neighborhoods. The firm's name matched the paperwork for 2 of the 3 previously flipped homes. Jeremy printed the file, added it to the growing pile, and emailed it to his attorney with a single sentence. I believe they're preparing a claim of nuisance or abandonment. His lawyer's reply was curt and sobering. They're likely trying to build a public record that shows a pattern of complaints and implied disrepair. Next step may be calling in sanitation, animal control, or citing you for obstruction. Stay ahead. Document daily. So Jeremy did. He began logging all maintenance activity. Grass cuttings, coop cleanings, egg counts, feed purchases. He took photos each morning and evening, not for pride, but for defense. He kept records as though building a case, because that's exactly what it was. Then came the letter that pushed everything toward a fulcrum. Folded into a standard neighborhood update was a proposed motion from the board, to be voted on at the next meeting. Proposal to limit visible livestock structures and establish setback requirements from shared boundaries. On the surface, it sounded reasonable, standard zoning language used to keep peace between close neighbors, but the details revealed its intent. The setback required would render Jeremy's coop non-compliant retroactively, and the board claimed authority to enforce it through fines and demolition orders if the structure wasn't relocated or removed. There was no grandfather clause, no consideration for prior approval, just language crafted to create selective enforcement. Jeremy read the proposal in silence, placed it beside his mug, and stared out the window toward the run where his hens moved quietly through the dirt. They were calm, oblivious, creatures of routine, instinct, and stillness. He envied them for that, and hated that they had become a battleground in someone else's campaign for authority. But he wasn't going to move the coop. He wasn't going to fold. Instead, he filed a counter-petition with the County Planning Commission, requesting that any new setback ordinances be subjected to public review and environmental impact assessments before being enacted retroactively. He also contacted a local journalist, someone known not for tabloid scandals but for deep reporting on municipal overreach. He didn't give a full interview, not yet. But he shared documentation and offered a quiet comment off record. Sometimes power hides in process, not policy. That was enough. The reporter began asking questions, not just to Jeremy, but to others, to Denise, to former homeowners, to the zoning office. And suddenly, Karen wasn't the one setting the narrative. She was the one being asked to explain it. Jeremy watched it unfold from a distance. Not with joy, but with that same old corporate intuition he had once used to predict hostile takeovers. The first sign wasn't when the proposal was withdrawn. It was when Karen failed to show up at the next board meeting, citing a family emergency. In her absence, another member tried to table the motion, but the room, for once, didn't fold under formality. One neighbor stood and asked clearly, "Why are we still pretending this is about chickens?" No one answered, because by then it wasn't. It was about authority and the limits of it, and Jeremy, quietly and methodically, had brought them to the edge of their own limits, without shouting, without spectacle, without once breaking the rules they used as weapons. By the time autumn arrived, the air in the neighborhood felt thinner, less like the passing of seasons and more like something being gradually siphoned out of the place. Jeremy noticed it in the way cars slowed near his home but didn't stop, how the laughter at the house across the street tapered off the moment someone spotted him near the gate, and how conversations among neighbors seemed to drop in volume when he approached, even from a distance. But none of it surprised him anymore. The past weeks had clarified everything. Karen and her shrinking circle weren't simply trying to pressure him into compliance. They were engineering a slow, procedural strangulation. One rule, one false citation, one whispered accusation at a time. They had hoped the vote to enact the setback ordinance would tip things in their favor. But Jeremy's preemptive strike, his filing with the Planning Commission, his strategic leak to the journalist, and the quiet groundswell of neighborhood support had quietly nurtured, had halted that plan before it could metastasize. What they didn't understand, even now, was that he didn't want to be right. He wanted to be left alone. That distinction, subtle as it was, defined everything. Still, he knew better than to think the retreat was permanent. Karen's absence from the board meetings wasn't a concession, it was reconfiguration. He had seen this before, in boardrooms and executive suites, when a CEO stepped aside just long enough to re-emerge with a different title and the same authority under a new structure. And sure enough, she resurfaced not through a vote, but through bureaucracy. The community newsletter, now noticeably absent of committee names, contained a short, dry notice about the formation of a temporary compliance sub-panel for evaluation of non-standard properties. There was no list of who was on this panel, no indication of what standards they used, just the phrase, "mandated inspection forthcoming." Jeremy knew then that the next phase had begun. The letter arrived 3 days later. It was crisp, legalistic, and utterly ambiguous. It stated that due to a community-initiated performance review, his property had been flagged for a mandatory multi-point inspection to ensure safety, sanitation, and conformity. The list of items to be reviewed ranged from structural compliance to general environmental impact. It wasn't signed by Karen, but the contact number at the bottom, when reverse-checked, led to a private voicemail account registered under her husband's name. Jeremy made no calls. Instead, he immediately contacted his attorney and requested that all communication from the board or any of its subcommittees be routed through counsel. He also filed a formal letter with the county requiring that any inspection on private property include representation from a neutral municipal party, not solely board-appointed inspectors. Legally, they had no right to enter his home or structures without consent or probable cause, and Jeremy knew it. What they were counting on was the same thing bureaucracies always counted on: exhaustion, fear, and apathy. But he had none of those left. Despite his legal blockades, activity began around his property in ways that were harder to trace. A drone hovered for 15 minutes over his backyard one afternoon, just out of slingshot range. 2 days later, orange markings appeared near the sidewalk, as if for a construction project, though no permits had been issued. The cameras he had installed months ago now became crucial. Reviewing footage, he saw a man in casual workwear with no visible badge or identification step onto the edge of his lawn, kneel, and spray paint a narrow X onto the concrete. Jeremy filed a police report, not because he expected immediate action, but because a pattern had to be documented. This wasn't vandalism. It was performance. They were constructing a narrative of neglect, one red arrow, one flagged bush, one blurred photo at a time. Then came the utility complaint. A technician from the gas company knocked one morning, explaining that there had been a report of a potential leak. Jeremy was cooperative, as always. He stood back and let the man perform his check, which returned clear. No issues. But 2 days later, a follow-up came, not from the utility company, but from the compliance sub-panel, referencing recent hazardous event and requesting updated documentation of all mechanical systems on the property. It was elegant in its simplicity. They weren't accusing him of anything. They were demanding he prove a negative. Jeremy didn't respond. Instead, he contacted an independent inspector, had a complete review performed, and submitted the certified clean report directly to the county infrastructure liaison, bypassing the board entirely. Privately, his lawyer advised him to prepare for escalation beyond policy. They may attempt code enforcement through alternate departments, or even file nuisance claims through civil court. At this point, it's not about chickens. It's about removing your stability so they can trigger a sale. Jeremy nodded, unsurprised. He was already considering his next moves, not just legally, but tactically. They wanted a fracture. He would give them a mirror. He began by reinforcing visibility. A sign appeared on his front lawn. Documented property. Audio-visual surveillance in use. He updated the co-op fencing with weatherproofed panels etched with municipal compliance citations and dates of inspection. At first glance, they looked like artwork. Jeremy's signature blend of steel and copper, shaped with a smith's precision, but upon closer look, they were records. Receipts. Facts made visible. He didn't threaten. He didn't provoke. He simply made it impossible for anyone to claim ignorance. Every permit, every dismissed complaint, every inspection pass was now a permanent part of the landscape. The board's silence turned brittle. And then Karen made her first direct move in months. A new neighbor, just moved in 2 blocks away, received a visit from her. Casual, friendly. She explained that the area had a certain standard and mentioned Jeremy in passing. "He's clever," she said, according to what the neighbor later told Jeremy. But clever doesn't mean cooperative. The implication was clear. Anyone associating with Jeremy was choosing a side. The neighbor, a retired federal employee with no patience for veiled threats, called Jeremy that evening and relayed the entire conversation verbatim. "I don't like being told who to talk to," he said bluntly, "and I sure as hell don't like someone playing neighborhood god." That was when Jeremy knew the second escalation had begun, not in paperwork, but in relationships. The campaign was no longer procedural. It was personal. People were being pressured to isolate him, not through rules, but through fear of contamination. That night, Jeremy wrote a letter. Not to the board, not to the paper, but to every neighbor who had ever attended his informal meetings, who had ever replied to one of his updates, who had ever even quietly nodded in passing. He wasn't asking for support. He was warning them, not with threats, but with documentation. He included a timeline, photos, a summary of property harassment tactics recognized in municipal complaint abuse, and he closed with one sentence. "If it can happen to me over chickens, it can happen to you over anything." The impact was subtle but immediate. People began talking again, cautiously at first, but then more openly. One woman placed a small handmade "Keep Calm and Cluck On" sign in her garden. Another neighbor stopped by unannounced to drop off a bag of scratch grain. And at the next community newsletter meeting, a previously disengaged board member submitted a motion for review. Proposal to dissolve the temporary compliance sub-panel pending audit. The motion didn't pass, but it went to a vote, and Karen, for the first time, was forced to argue publicly for the existence of a committee that had never formally been disclosed. Still, Jeremy wasn't under illusions. The board wouldn't relent out of shame. They would either be stopped through institutional mechanisms, or they would escalate until he either made a mistake or left. He wouldn't do either. Instead, he began preparing for a final phase. He retained a new attorney, one with experience not just in real estate law but in strategic litigation against organized harassment. He documented every drone sighting, every anonymous call to animal control, every instance where one of his property boundaries was tampered with. And then he waited, because he knew the pattern. Those who rely on pressure eventually overstep. They push one step too far. That moment came on a cold Thursday morning when Jeremy received a citation for illegal animal signage. The letter claimed that the small signs displayed on his coop fencing constituted advertising, in violation of Municipal Code 14.7 regarding unlicensed commercial messaging. It was absurd, but it was also proof that someone was now pulling city strings, likely feeding information to departments outside the board's purview, hoping to provoke an official fine that could trigger legal consequences. Jeremy didn't respond. He didn't pay. He instead walked directly into the city's code enforcement office and requested a supervisor. He presented the signage, the permits, the legal status of the co-op, the independent inspection documentation, and when the supervisor offered a tepid apology and a "we'll look into it," Jeremy handed over a sealed envelope addressed to the city attorney's office containing a preliminary notice of litigation under the Civil Harassment and Misuse of Government Process Act. It wasn't a bluff. It wasn't rage. It was preparation. And the moment they opened that envelope, the board would no longer be dealing with a private citizen. They'd be dealing with a public case. That night, the cameras caught someone walking the perimeter of his property with a flashlight, low to the ground, scanning the coop, the mailbox, the edges of the driveway. Jeremy didn't call the police. He didn't need to. He had the footage. He had the file. And the moment the court required evidence, he would supply it in full. The second escalation wasn't a burst. It was a pressure system, slow and suffocating. But Jeremy hadn't just endured it. He had mapped it, documented it, mirrored it. And in doing so, he had turned their structure into a trap of their own making. They were now the ones on record. They were now the ones improvising. And Jeremy, sitting calmly on his porch with a quiet run of hens pecking at the grass, was simply watching the inevitable consequence of their overreach begin to settle over them like morning fog, slow, cold, and irreversible. It began with silence. Not the usual kind, the strategic, cold quiet that the board had perfected over months of indirect warfare, but a different kind, heavy and brittle, like the moment before glass shatters. Jeremy felt it the morning he received no mail, not a newsletter, not an anonymous flyer, not even the usual circulars stuffed into his mailbox. He double-checked the security footage, verifying that no carrier had arrived at all. At first, he thought it might be a service lapse, until he walked 3 houses down and saw envelopes in every other box. It wasn't negligence. It was precision. Someone had requested his address be suspended from delivery. A small, bureaucratic move, subtle enough to go unnoticed, but symbolically unmistakable. This was the first real breach. They had reached beyond whispers and manipulated a federal system to make him disappear, at least on paper. Jeremy filed the proper forms with the USPS, alerting them to the unauthorized request and documenting everything. But something about the tactic made him pause longer than usual. This wasn't just a squeeze. It was a soft erasure. He began to understand the endgame. Push him out without expelling him. Make the home uninhabitable in practical terms. Isolate him from the networked conveniences of suburban life, communication, reputation, routine, until he sold by choice, until the system never had to admit to force. And with that realization came the understanding that the next strike would not be about zoning or citations. It would be personal and permanent. 2 days later, it came. Jeremy returned from town to find his backyard gate unlatched. Not broken, not forced, but clearly opened and left swinging. Inside the coop, feathers littered the ground in uneven piles. One hen was missing entirely. Another lay still, crushed under the weight of something not animal but deliberate. There were no drag marks, no torn fencing, no signs of panic as would be expected from a natural predator. Just destruction. Quick, clean, and targeted. It was not an accident. It was a message. Jeremy moved slowly, carefully collecting what he could, covering what he had to, and storing the footage. He didn't cry. He didn't curse. He just walked back inside, locked the doors, and called his attorney. "It's time," he said. The civil harassment complaint was filed within 24 hours. Accompanying it was a package delivered directly to the city attorney's office, containing timelines, video evidence, zoning documentation, and a forensic report from an independent veterinary pathologist. The death of the hen was classified as trauma inflicted by blunt instrument, most likely a boot or shovel. No animal DNA, no accident. The claim wasn't made against Karen directly. Jeremy understood better than anyone that power hides behind procedure, but it named the board, the compliance sub-panel, and unidentified associated agents acting in coordination. The city could no longer ignore the story. It should have ended there. But Karen wasn't done. The next board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening. Jeremy, as usual, did not attend. He had never needed to. Their actions always made their way to him eventually. But this time, something changed. That evening, as dusk fell and porch lights clicked on up and down the street, Jeremy received an unexpected knock at his door. It was Denise, the retired math teacher who had once stood up in that meeting and asked, "Why are we pretending this is about chickens?" She was pale, visibly shaken. "You need to see this," she said, handing him a printed flyer. On it, Jeremy's photo had been pasted, an old image, grainy, likely taken from a neighborhood group site, above a headline that read, "Unstable Resident Endangering Community Harmony." Beneath it was a list of exaggerated incidents, fabrications, and twisted details. Hostile language, aggressive signage, unauthorized surveillance. It wasn't just character assassination, it was defamation, distributed anonymously and left at doorsteps throughout the neighborhood. Jeremy scanned the flyer once, then set it down. Denise watched him, waiting for fury or grief, but what she saw instead was stillness. "They've overreached," he said finally. "They put it in print. That's a legal artifact now." The lawsuit was amended the next morning to include defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and reckless endangerment of property. Jeremy's attorney delivered cease and desist notices to all known board members and issued a formal request for discovery. He also filed a motion for injunctive relief, requesting immediate suspension of board actions pending investigation. It was no longer a neighborhood dispute. It was litigation. Within days, the story began leaking, not through media manipulation, not through spectacle, but through quiet indignation. Residents who had once kept their heads down began to speak. People compared notes, timelines, messages. Someone forwarded Jeremy an email chain in which Karen had written, "If we don't contain this now, he'll think he owns the place." Another neighbor found a discarded notebook in the community hall trash with annotations about property optics, behavioral compliance, and trigger thresholds. The evidence painted a picture not of a community preserving its values, but of a small group orchestrating a campaign to purge dissent under the guise of neighborhood stewardship. As the case gained traction, the board fractured. 2 members resigned quietly. A third submitted a formal letter of apology to the city, disavowing recent actions and citing a pattern of coercion by Karen and her supporters. Public sentiment shifted. No longer was Jeremy the isolated eccentric with chickens and vests. He became a symbol of quiet defiance, of what it meant to push back against structures that abused their power behind the mask of civility. Then came the last act. Karen requested an emergency neighborhood assembly, not a board meeting, but an open gathering. She claimed it was to restore unity, but Jeremy recognized the maneuver. It was a final appeal to sentiment, an attempt to reframe the narrative before consequences fell. Against advice, Jeremy attended, not to argue, but to listen. He stood in the back, silent, arms folded. Karen took the stage, if one could call the front of a borrowed rec room a stage, and began with a tone of false humility. She spoke of misunderstandings, of confusion around intentions, and of a shared vision for the community. She never named Jeremy directly, but every sentence was a veiled strike. "We must be vigilant about radical elements," she said at one point. "People who refuse to integrate, who weaponize our kindness." Jeremy stepped forward only once when a neighbor stood and asked directly, "Is it true you submitted that flyer?" The room fell into a long silence, and Karen hesitated. Just a breath too long. "I didn't approve its distribution," she said carefully, and the words fell flat. Not a denial, just a deflection. Jeremy spoke only 10 words that night. "Truth doesn't need permission to exist. It documents itself." Then he left. The following week, the board was suspended pending investigation. Karen was named in the complaint. The compliance sub-panel was dissolved permanently. The city launched an ethics probe into the board's use of municipal resources, and several contracts tied to Karen's husband's firm were flagged for review. Jeremy didn't celebrate. He cleaned his coop, he fed the hens, he repaired the gate. The culmination wasn't an explosion, it was exposure. They had tried to paint him as unstable, but in the end it was their structure, their rules, their process, their control, that had proven unsustainable. And Jeremy, who had simply refused to move, had become the immovable object they couldn't bury. They had tried to break him. Instead, they broke themselves. The neighborhood was quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet that had settled in during the early months, the passive, watchful silence of suspicion and controlled optics. This silence felt earned, like the stillness after a storm that had lingered just long enough to change the shape of everything it touched. Jeremy noticed it first, not in the absence of letters or citations, but in how people walked. Their pace had shifted. They no longer glanced over their shoulders before looking in his direction, no longer lowered their voices when passing his gate. They waved now, some sheepishly, others earnestly, but all of them with the tentative air of people realizing they'd been standing too close to something corrosive without noticing the burn. Karen had vanished from public life almost overnight. After the board suspension, she resigned from her remaining committee positions and removed herself from the group chats she once dominated. Her house remained. Lights still flicked on at regular intervals, but she no longer walked the block, no longer policed lawns or hovered near curbs with a phone in hand. Rumor had it she and her husband were considering selling, but no listing had gone up yet. Jeremy didn't care either way. He no longer watched for her. She had been reduced to what she had always feared becoming, irrelevant. The lawsuit hadn't gone to trial. In the weeks following the culmination, the city, pressured by public scrutiny and legal caution, pushed for settlement.